All right, so this is chapter 19, the endocrine system lecture. And if you are still around, this is your last lecture of anatomy for the semester. So congratulations for making it to the end. The cartoon here is pancreas, right? So pancreas, what happened to your beta cells? Don't you need those to make insulin? You are producing insulin, aren't you, right? And then we have diabetes, don't we? So the pancreas has specialized cells, and you should remember this from the digestive system. These cells are found within the islets, the pancreatic islets, and there's one set of these cells called beta cells, and the beta cells make insulin. So if the pancreas does not make insulin, then that is type 1 diabetes. So I'll talk about that when we get there. This is another example of a hormonal issue. This is a person Robert Wadlow, and he was almost 9 feet tall, and he died at a very early age. But he was so tall because he had a tumor in his pituitary gland, and his pituitary gland, or our pituitary glands, are responsible for making growth hormones. So when he was very young, he was producing a huge amount of growth hormone, and it caused his whole body to grow a lot taller than normal. It turns out when people are very, very tall like this, that their pulley system, the muscles and bones don't actually work that well, so they actually tend to be weak. You would think that, if you're very tall, you might be very strong, but actually the opposite is true. It also causes many health problems. As you can see, he died pretty early on in his life. Okay, so let's talk about hormones. So if you look at Roman numeral 1, endocrine glands are going to secrete their substances into the bloodstream. That's the definition of an endocrine gland. Remember, the other kinds of glands are called exocrine glands that secreted their substances into a duct first, or they can secrete it into a cavity or outside the body. But these go into the bloodstream, and so they're creating hormones. And hormones, right, so in this picture here, this is our secreting cell. So this is the cell that creates our hormone. The hormone enters the bloodstream, and then it circulates around our whole body within the bloodstream. So where the hormone acts is going to depend on the target cell. Target cells are cells that have the receptor, a working functional receptor for the hormone. So when there's an attachment like this, a binding, then that target cell can respond to the hormone. So all of your cells in your body are not going to respond to all the hormones that you're making. So there will be cells that don't have that receptor. So that's going to be, a non-target or not a target cell. It does not have receptors for that hormone. So the hormones will circulate around the body, and then it'll attach to the receptors. Those cells with the receptors will respond to the hormone. So problems and issues with hormone imbalances are usually because there's either too much or too little produced, right? So on the secreting end, that's the more common, more prevalent kind of issue with hormones, is that you're not making adequate amounts or you're making too much. But there are also things called insensitivities, where you have the hormone present in adequate amounts, but you're not responding to it. So that's a problem on the target end. The example of this is type 2 diabetes, where you're actually creating insulin. Your body makes insulin, but somehow your cells are not sensitive to insulin. And there's also something called androgen insensitivity syndrome, where the target cell with the receptor is not working correctly. And so the person's cells can never detect androgen. If you remember what androgens are, they're male hormones. And so in development, if you can't detect a male hormone, then the fetus will automatically default to female, right? Because there's no androgen signal. Even though the chromosome might be XY. So chromosomally, there are, people walking around out there that are XY chromosomally male, but because they have this androgen insensitivity syndrome, they actually turned out to be physically female. And also remember that your physical, your anatomy and your sort of gender preference or sexual preference is completely different. So just wanted to let you guys know that there is those two issues, right? The secreting end or the target end can be problematic with hormones. So here's just another illustration of hormones and their target cells, right? So this cell here just has receptors for hormone A, so it's only going to respond to hormone A. This cell here only has receptors for hormone B, so it's only going to respond to hormone B. And this cell has both receptors, so it can respond to both hormones. Now, if you look at the two bolded words in the second part of your first endocrine gland introduction, there are two categories of hormones. They are either amino acid based, so they are modified amino acids, or they're small peptides, small amino acid chains, or they can be proteins. And the other class is steroids. So remember, steroids are a kind of lipid. And if you look at this picture, I know it's a little blurry, the only information I want you guys to get from this image is that peptide hormones, these hormones that are little proteins, they are usually water soluble, and so they're going to have a receptor on the cell membrane. So the target cell will have the receptor on the cell membrane. And this is just like the images right here, right? So these are all representing membrane-bound receptors. Steroid hormones are a little different. Steroid hormones, because the membrane is lipid and these are lipid, these can diffuse right through the cell membrane and enter the cell. So the hormones receptors for steroids are actually inside the cell. So they're intracellular receptors. So there's a receptor for the hormone. And so in both cases, the similarity is that when you have binding of that hormone to the receptor, there is information going to the nucleus to change gene expression. So you can get differential gene expression when the hormone's present, okay? So for both scenarios, you're affecting the gene expression of the cell, just the hormone receptor is in different spots. All right, let's talk about what stimulates the production of hormones. So your hormones are stimulated by three different things. The first one is called humoral stimulation. This is basically the glands or your brain can detect certain levels of hormone in your bloodstream, and that will dictate whether or not your glands will secrete more hormone or less hormone. So that's called humoral. So it detects substances in the blood. Neural stimulation is where the nervous system actually goes to the adrenal gland here, or the gland, and prompts the secretion of hormone by this nervous impulse. There's only one example of this, and this is going to be the adrenal gland. So this is why we see the adrenal gland here. And then the third and more prevalent way that hormones are controlled and secreted are by other hormones. So you'll find that as we go on, the hypothalamus, this region of the brain, remember you learned it as a homeostatic region of the brain that, helps to maintain homeostasis throughout the body. It actually influences, it creates hormones, and it influences the hormones that are secreted from the pituitary gland. Those pituitary gland hormones are going to influence the secretion of other glands in the body. So there's a chain reaction of hormones that will stimulate other hormones to be produced. So that's hormonal stimulation. And we'll talk about one specifically, which is TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, and how it stimulates the thyroid gland. All right, so this is Roman numeral 2, the endocrine glands. So I want you to know this chart, and this is pretty much an overview and review of the things I've talked about before in this class. So you should recognize the pineal gland, the hypothalamus, so we're going to talk about new things, the pituitary gland. But so take a look at all these different organs that actually produce hormones. Some of them might surprise you, such as the heart. The heart actually produces a hormone called natriuretic or atrial natriuretic protein. And the fat adipose tissue creates hormones. Your intestines will make hormones. Your GI tract digestive tract does make hormones. I didn't mention them. You will learn your hormones in physiology class though. So make sure you know this image, and we will go through the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, the thymus, the hormones that it makes here. We'll go through the suprarenal glands. We will go through the parathyroid, and then everything else is going to be review. All right, so we're going to start off with the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is also called the hypophysis. So if you remember way back to our bones, we had the hypophyseal fossa, right? So this is our cella-turcica region of the sphenoid bone. That depression is called the hypophyseal fossa because our hypophysis, the adrenal gland, the pituitary gland is going to be cradled and protected in this area. So the secretions of this pituitary gland are controlled by the hypothalamus. So let me actually show you this other picture here. Notice how the hypothalamus, right, this is going to create or secrete regulatory hormones. The regulatory hormones are going to come down and they're going to regulate the secretion of hormones from the anterior pituitary. So let me just start off by saying that if you look at the pituitary gland on both this image and the other one, it's divided in half. So the anterior portion, the front of the pituitary gland, is called the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, or the adenohypophysis. The posterior lobe is simply called the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, or it can be called the Neuro Hypothesis. So adeno refers to epithelial cells. This is glandular. So if you look at the way that this image is drawn, you see how the cells here look like little epithelial cells. That's what it is. So a little bit of cuboidal, but these cells are epithelial cells and they're glands. So this is glandular tissue. This is very different than the posterior side. And if you look closely right here, we have neurons that are in the hypothalamus. And these neurons, their projection, right, the body or the soma is in the hypothalamus, but their long axon actually comes into the posterior lobe. So the posterior lobe is really just a bunch of axons. So it's nervous tissue. So we have two completely different kinds of tissue, right? We have epithelial tissue and then we have nervous tissue. So I wanted to get you guys oriented this way because we see that the hypothalamus will secrete hormones. These hormones will talk to and communicate with the anterior pituitary. And the anterior pituitary will respond by secreting another set of hormones. Okay? So ultimately, the hypothalamus controls whether or not the pituitary gland secretes hormone. On the neuro side, we have the neurons of the hypothalamus making the hormone, and then the hormone is stored within the terminal, right, the axon terminals, and then secreted from the posterior side. So let's talk about one thing before we move on to the actual hormones. So if you're in your outline, you see that the pituitary gland is protected by the cella turcica. And if you had a pituitary tumor, like the gentleman that we just talked about here, I'll go show you again, like he had a pituitary tumor, right? So where does that tumor, where does the extra tissue grow? Because if you look at it, this is all encased in bone. So extra tissue can't go anywhere within the bone, so it grows up. And one of the classic sort of signs of a pituitary tumor is some kind of optical disturbance, because you see your optic chiasm is here. So this is your optic nerve coming in and forming that cross. So all this extra tissue, if you do have a tumor, it will come up and then compress your optic chiasm, causing visual disturbances. Okay, so let's talk about the neuro hypothesis, number one. Let's look at this. Come back to that. So in the posterior pituitary, you want to know that it secretes two hormones. The hormone is called antidiuretic hormone, abbreviated ADH. This hormone retains water in the body, right? Because you probably have heard of the word diuretic before. So there are drugs that are diuretics, or you can say like caffeine is a diuretic, because when you drink caffeine or when you take the drug, it helps your body lose water. So it rapidly can dehydrate you. Antidiuretic is going to retain water in the body. So this hormone is critical for maintaining appropriate water content in your body. So it helps your kidneys reabsorb water. The more water you have in your body, the more blood volume you have. The more blood volume you have gives you more blood pressure. So this is really important. Another word for this hormone is called vasopressin. So you may have heard of vasopressin before. So that's one hormone. The other hormone is called oxytocin. Oxytocin is a hormone that has a lot of different jobs. The sort of official job for reproduction is this contraction of smooth muscle within the reproductive tract. So oxytocin is required to contract the smooth muscle of your uterus during childbirth. It also causes contractions in smooth muscle of the breast for milk ejection. You might remember that from reproductive system. In males, it can cause the smooth muscle in the glands of the prostate and ductus deferens to contract and eject secretions of those organs. And then the other oxytocin function was this bonding mechanism. So lots of research has been shown that oxytocin increases bonding and empathy between people. But too much oxytocin is also sort of not good. I read that too much oxytocin can actually form envy. You can become jealous and envious of somebody else. But there is this bonding, definitely a bonding function to oxytocin. Okay, so those are the two hormones from the posterior pituitary gland that you want to know. And then if you look at the adeno hypothesis number 2, I grouped the hormones here into stimulating hormones. So what I have is that the adeno hypothesis is glandular tissue. There's a variety of stimulating hormones as well as growth hormones. So the one hormone I want you to know my name is called growth hormone. You can probably think of, understand what this hormone does. It helps your body grow. So it's very, very important early on when you are small, child, prepubescent, to help grow to a taller person. And it helps stimulate the growth of all kinds of tissues in the body, protein synthesis, lipid mobilization, and catabolism. So it helps to liberate energy for growth. And that's what, Arthur Wadlow had too much of, growth hormone. The other hormones, okay, so you don't need to know these by name except for this, because we're going to talk about thyroid stimulating hormone. But the other ones are all stimulating. So if you look at thyroid stimulating hormone, this stimulates the thyroid to produce its hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone stimulates the adrenal gland to produce its hormone in the cortex specifically. Gonadotropins, these are hormones that stimulate the ovary and the testes, right, to create their hormones and to jumpstart the process of gamete production. We have prolactin that stimulates the breast tissue, right, the mammary gland, to produce milk. And we have melanocyte stimulating hormone that stimulates melanocytes to increase melanin in the epidermis. So the sort of overall sort of unifying characteristic of these hormones is that they stimulate other glands of the body. So they're stimulating hormones. All right. So, but ultimately, remember, these are all ultimately controlled by the hypothalamus. That's why the hypothalamus is up here. All right. So let's talk about this histology slide. So the pituitary gland will be part of your histology requirements. This is actually kind of an easy organ to sort of identify. It looks like a pituitary gland. It's going to be nice and round. It will have a dark side, number 1, and it'll have a lighter side, number 2. The dark side is always the glandular epithelial tissue. So remember, when you have a histology slide, the organelle that picks up stain is the nucleus. If you have a lot of nuclei together, it'll stain dark. And that's basically what epithelial tissue is. Remember, epithelial tissue is cellular. It's basically cells right next to each other. So you have a lot of nuclei and it's going to stain very dark. On the other side, the pituitary, the Neuro Hypothesis, is nervous tissue. So what do you have here? You have a collection of axons, and then you'll have the neuroglia, but not, axons are not, they don't contain the nucleus. They're just projections of the cytoplasm, which doesn't pick up a lot of stain. So the Neuro Hypothesis will not ever be as dark as the Adeno Hypothesis, because the Neuro Hypothesis contains axons, so it's not, you don't have those dark nuclei. And then you see number 3, right? This is your infundibulum, this stalk that holds the pituitary gland to the brain. So you should be able to recognize the 2 lobes. And again, you can call them posterior lobe or anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, or you can say neurohypophysis or adenohypophysis. And then do also recognize the infundibulum. All right, so I think we're done with the pituitary gland. Let's talk about the thyroid gland. So the thyroid gland is going to be attached to the inferior region of the larynx. So it's on the trachea and inferior to the larynx. It's going to be a two-lobed organ. So we have two large halves. Those are called left and right lobes. And then there's a center or a central structure called the isthmus. If you look at the histology of the thyroid gland, this is also part of your histology component. The histology is that the thyroid gland is going to be filled with these round, you can think of as balls, right? Like hollow balls. These are follicles, just like the ovary had follicles. So we have a collection of cuboidal cells that will create a follicle. And then inside the follicle will be a smooth pink substance called colloid. So the colloid word is right here. And the colloid is going to be a substance that's going to have the precursors of the hormones that the thyroid gland makes. So it's going to have a precursor of, it's basically called thyroglobulin to make the two thyroid hormones called T3 and T4. Okay. So what you want to recognize is this, right? So you have an image like this. This is going to be thyroid. You're going to identify the round structure here as a follicle. The smooth pink substance inside will be colloid. And then between the follicles, you'll have some cells, and those are going to be called parafollicular cells. And they're going to secrete calcitonin. Okay, so if you look at your outline, I do list what the two hormones of the thyroid gland do. And I said two, it's actually three hormones. So letter A, let's talk about T3 and T4. So before we get to this, let's talk about T3 and T4. So T3 and T4 are hormones that control metabolic rate. So the 3 and the 4 refer to the number of iodine atoms required to make them. So your iodine is gotten through the diet, right? You can't just invent iodine. Your body just can't do that. It's a micronutrient that you have to have in your diet every day to make adequate amounts of T3 and T4. And what T3 and T4 do is it's kind of like the idle of your engine. So it's your metabolic rate. It also influences protein synthesis. It's your energy production. It's, in this slide that I got from the internet, it's the most important hormone in day-to-day regulation of the metabolic rate. Okay. So what will stimulate T3 and T4 being created is if your metabolic rate dips, then there's a signal to a feedback mechanism to the brain that helps to stimulate T3 and T4 production. If you have low amounts of T3 and T4, that's going to stimulate more T3 and T4 being made. Or if you have high amounts of TSH. So here we go. This is the thyroid stimulating hormone that's secreted from your pituitary gland, your anterior pituitary. So this is going to stimulate your thyroid gland to make T3 and T4. So if you have a lot of stimulating hormone, you're going to make more T3 and T4, right? So stimulated by high amounts of TSH. Let's look at this actually. So now that we know that T3 and T4 are responsible for metabolism, if you make too little or too much, those conditions are called hypothyroidism. Hypo is too little T3 and T4. Hyperthyroidism is too much T3 and T4. So if you think about this as your metabolic rate, if you're low on T3 and T4, that means your body is kind of ramped down on its energy production. So you're going to feel tired, lethargy. You might gain weight because you're not burning a lot of calories. You might feel cold. You might be constipated. The smooth muscle, your peristalsis has slowed down. You might have some hair loss, dry skin, depression. Bradycardia, remember this means your heart rate is slow. You might have memory impairment. This is the stopping of having your period. So these are all sort of signs and symptoms of a low metabolic rate. Hyperthyroidism and then is just the opposite, right? So tachycardia, you're kind of like sped up, right? So you're going to be sort of like pushing the gas on the car, like revving the engine. So the heart rate's going to go up. You have tachycardia. You may have palpitations with that. You may become hyperactive. You have a lot of energy. You may lose weight. You may, but with increased appetite. So you're hungry because you're burning a lot of calories. So your cells are just burning up a lot of calories. You're going to feel hungry, but you're at the same time you're losing weight. You're going to be hot. You're going to sweat, and all these other things too, right? So I'm not even going to ask you guys to know these are just technical terms, but just to give you guys an idea that too little or too much of a thyroid hormone, this is what T3 and T4 does. Okay, so let's talk about our goiter here. So I want to look at this. So here is our hypothalamus, and here's our pituitary gland, right? And our pituitary gland, our anterior pituitary, is making thyroid stimulating hormone. The thyroid stimulating hormone goes into the bloodstream, hits our target gland, our thyroid gland, and the reaction is make T3 and T4, right? And these are going to go and do their thing on the targets, on their organs. When you're secreting T3 and T4, adequate amounts of T3 and T4 will feed back to the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland and say like, okay, we have adequate amounts, we can stop producing the stimulating hormone, because this hormone, the stimulating hormone, is what's going to make the thyroid gland make T3 and T4. So if you have adequate amounts, you're going to stop the production of thyroid stimulating hormone. Now, let's introduce iodine deficiency. We're going to talk about this goiter. We know that T3 and T4 require iodine in the diet, right? So this and this. If you just draw an X here, if we don't have iodine in the diet, we can just totally block this off, okay? So you're not creating T3 and T4 just because you're not eating the right foods that they don't have iodine. This level goes down. What happens here? Is it still a negative sign? No, because if these levels go down, then it's going to actually stimulate. Then the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are going to say, hey, what happened to T3 and T4? We need to stimulate the thyroid gland to make more. So the the pituitary gland here will kick out more TSH. The thyroid stimulating hormone will stimulate the thyroid gland, and the thyroid gland tends to enlarge if it's going to be overstimulated. It can't do anything about this, right? Because it still cannot make T3 and T4, because if you're not eating iodine, you're not creating T3 and T4. So as long as you're not getting iodine, you're going to have a lot of thyroid stimulating hormone produced by the pituitary gland. It's going to overstimulate your thyroid gland, and it's going to grow. And that's what a goiter is. So let's take a look at a goiter, right? So a goiter is an enlarged thyroid gland. And it's because, and actually I should say that there's different ways that you can have a goiter. This is just one, this iodine deficiency. Okay, so I hope you understand that this is because of that overstimulation of the thyroid gland to produce its hormone. Your brain doesn't know you're not eating iodine. Your brain just knows you don't have adequate amounts of T3 and T4 in the body. So it stimulates and stimulates and stimulates your thyroid gland, and your thyroid gland swells up, and that's a goiter. So it turns out that this is the reason why you have iodized salt. So there was a condition around World War I where there was a lot of areas in the Midwest, they actually called it the goiter belt, where 30%, a third of the people had goiters. So the move was to supplement salt with iodine. So if you go to the grocery store today, still you can find iodized salt. And this is to ensure that everybody gets iodine in their diet to minimize the goiter. All right, so that's that issue, right? So the goiter is produced by an iodine deficiency. Hopefully you can say why. And the other hormone I just want to point out here, the calcitonin. So the cells between the follicles are going to make calcitonin, and this takes your calcium from the bloodstream and puts it into the bone. So think about calcitonin as calcium in. So when you drink milk, you're going to take that excess calcium and put it in your bones for storage, and that's what calcitonin does. All right, so on the posterior side of your thyroid gland, you have embedded 4 little other glands, these are called parathyroid glands. And if you look at the histology slide, you can see that they're very different than the thyroid tissue. So the thyroid tissue here, you'll see the follicles with the colloid inside, and then you'll see a mass of very different looking tissue. So this is your parathyroid gland. And the only thing you want to know here is that the hormone it makes is called parathyroid hormone. And it's going to be also a regulator of calcium. So this is going to do the opposite job as calcitonin. So I mentioned calcitonin is going to take the calcium in your blood and put it into your bones. It's going to minimize or reduce the calcium concentration of your blood. This is the opposite action. So parathyroid hormone is going to stimulate your osteoclasts. The osteoclasts are going to digest the bone and liberate calcium into the bloodstream. So it actually increases the blood calcium content. The word you want to know about hormones that have opposite action is the word antagonistic. So calcitonin and parathyroid hormone are called antagonistic hormones because they have opposite action on calcium levels in the bloodstream. All right, so we'll pause here for the end of part 1.